Hey everyone! Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're covering a story that's unlike almost anything happening in the criminal justice world right now. It's a case involving one of the most notorious gangs ever connected to both the United States and Central America, a gang whose name has been linked to brutal murders, extortion, drug trafficking, and decades of violence. Now, imagine walking into a courtroom and seeing not 5 defendants, not 50, but 486 alleged MS-13 members facing prosecution in the same historic legal proceeding. According to Salvadoran prosecutors, these defendants are collectively accused of more than 47,000 crimes, including around 29,000 murders, allegedly committed over a 10-year period. If those allegations sound unbelievable, you're not alone. The scale of this case has drawn attention from governments, legal experts, journalists, and human rights organizations around the world. This isn't a fictional courtroom drama or the plot of a crime series. It's a real legal case unfolding in El Salvador in 2026, and many experts believe it represents one of the largest gang prosecutions in modern history. For American viewers, this story is especially important because MS-13 didn't originate in El Salvador. It was founded in Los Angeles during the 1980s, before expanding across national borders. What happens in this trial could have implications far beyond Central America, including for law enforcement agencies in the United States that continue to investigate MS-13 activity. So, in today's documentary, we'll break down how this gang became so powerful, why the Salvadoran government decided to prosecute hundreds of alleged members at once, what evidence prosecutors say they have, why the trial has become so controversial, and what this entire case could mean for the future of organized crime on both sides of the border. Before we begin, if you enjoy professionally researched true crime documentaries and in-depth criminal investigations, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue bringing you well-researched stories like this. To understand why this trial is making headlines around the world, we first need to understand the organization at the center of it all. MS-13, also known by its full Spanish name, Mara Salvatrucha. Many Americans are surprised to learn that MS-13 did not originate in El Salvador. Instead, the gang was formed in the 1980s in the Pico Union neighborhood of Los Angeles, California. During that time, thousands of Salvadorans fled a brutal civil war in their home country and settled in Southern California. Many were young immigrants trying to build new lives, but they often found themselves living in neighborhoods already dominated by established street gangs. In that environment, some Salvadoran youths formed their own group for protection and identity. Over time, that group evolved into what would become MS-13. What began as a local street gang eventually transformed into one of the most feared transnational criminal organizations in the Western Hemisphere. As members moved or were deported between the United States and El Salvador, the gang expanded its reach across borders. Federal and local law enforcement agencies have investigated MS-13 activity in multiple parts of the United States, particularly in states such as California, New York, Virginia, and Maryland, as well as the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. MS-13 developed a reputation for extreme violence. Prosecutors in numerous criminal cases have linked the gang to brutal attacks, including murders carried out with firearms, knives, and, in some cases, machetes. Law enforcement officials have also accused the organization of targeting rival gang members, suspected informants, and even its own members who were believed to have broken gang rules. These allegations helped cement MS-13's reputation as one of the most violent criminal organizations operating in both the United States and Central America. But while the gang's roots trace back to Los Angeles, its strongest base eventually became El Salvador. Over the years, authorities say MS-13 grew far beyond a traditional street gang. In many communities, prosecutors allege the organization established a sophisticated criminal network that exercised significant control over entire neighborhoods. Businesses were allegedly forced to pay regular extortion money simply to continue operating. Public transportation workers, small shop owners, and local families reportedly lived under constant threats of violence if they refused to comply. According to Salvadoran authorities, the gang also became deeply involved in drug distribution, weapons trafficking, and other organized criminal activities, while using fear and intimidation to maintain its influence. For years, gang violence contributed to El Salvador, recording one of the highest homicide rates in the world. Entire communities were affected by the constant threat of extortion, recruitment, and deadly attacks. That atmosphere of fear ultimately set the stage for the unprecedented government crackdown that would follow, a crackdown that has now led to one of the largest mass gang trials in modern history. Transition. But everything changed in 2022, when the Salvadoran government decided it would no longer fight MS-13 using traditional methods. Instead, it launched an extraordinary nationwide crackdown that would reshape the country's criminal justice system. For years, many Salvadorans felt that gangs like MS-13 had become so deeply entrenched that the government was losing control. Entire neighborhoods were considered off-limits. Businesses routinely paid extortion money to survive, and many families lived with the constant fear that refusing a gang's demands could have deadly consequences. Successive governments had tried different strategies to combat gang violence, but for many citizens, the results were limited. Then, in March 2022, the situation reached a breaking point. Over the course of a single weekend, 87 people were killed, making it one of the deadliest outbreaks of violence in El Salvador's recent history. Salvadoran authorities blamed MS-13 for coordinating the attacks, though individual criminal responsibility would later become part of ongoing investigations and court proceedings. The sudden surge in killings shocked the country and intensified public pressure for decisive action. In response, President Nayib Bukele announced an unprecedented nationwide crackdown. El Salvador's Legislative Assembly approved a state of emergency, granting authorities temporary powers that significantly expanded law enforcement's ability to combat organized crime. Under those emergency measures, certain constitutional protections were temporarily suspended. Police and military forces received broader arrest authority, and investigators were given additional tools to pursue suspected gang members. The government's objective was clear: dismantle the leadership, disrupt gang operations, and regain control of communities that authorities believed had been dominated by criminal organizations for years. What followed became one of the largest anti-gang operations in modern history. According to the Salvadoran government, more than 91,000 suspected gang members have been arrested since the state of emergency began. Many of those arrests targeted alleged members of MS-13 and its longtime rival, Barrio 18, while others remain the subject of ongoing legal proceedings. Authorities argue that the campaign severely weakened the gang's command structure and significantly reduced their ability to operate openly. Government statistics also indicate a dramatic decline in violent crime. Officials report that El Salvador's homicide rate fell to approximately 1.3 killings per 100,000 people, a figure that represents a remarkable change for a country that once recorded one of the highest murder rates in the world. Supporters of President Bukele point to those numbers as evidence that the aggressive strategy has made everyday life safer for millions of Salvadorans. For many Americans watching this story, those figures stand out because they are lower than homicide rates reported in many U.S. cities. Supporters argue that the crackdown restored security to neighborhoods that had lived under gang control for decades. Critics, however, say the dramatic improvements came at the cost of weakened civil liberties and expanded government powers, an issue that continues to fuel debate both inside El Salvador and internationally. One thing, however, is beyond dispute. The arrests marked only the beginning. Once thousands of suspected gang members were in custody, prosecutors faced the enormous challenge of bringing them before the courts. That challenge would soon lead to one of the most extraordinary criminal trials the modern world has ever seen. By 2026, the Salvadoran government's campaign against the gangs had entered a completely new chapter. The focus was no longer on making arrests, it had shifted to the courtroom. Prosecutors now faced the enormous task of trying hundreds of suspected gang members while presenting evidence for crimes that allegedly spanned an entire decade. In April 2026, authorities launched what legal experts have described as one of the largest mass criminal trials in modern history. At the center of the case are 486 alleged members of MS-13, including individuals prosecutors identify as part of the gang's highest-ranking leadership, commonly referred to as La Ranfla. According to investigators, these leaders were responsible for directing the organization's operations across the country, issuing orders, coordinating criminal activity, and maintaining discipline within the gang. The scope of the allegations is staggering. According to Salvadoran prosecutors, the defendants are collectively charged with more than 47,000 criminal offenses allegedly committed between 2012 and 2022. These allegations include approximately 29,000 murders, along with femicides, forced disappearances, extortion schemes, drug trafficking, illegal weapons trafficking, and other serious offenses. Prosecutors also accuse the organization of rebellion, arguing that MS-13 allegedly attempted to establish a parallel criminal authority capable of challenging the authority of the Salvadoran state in areas under its influence. It's important to remember that these are criminal allegations presented by prosecutors. Each defendant remains entitled to the legal process established by Salvadoran courts, and the trial is intended to determine whether the evidence supports those charges. For American viewers, one of the most unusual aspects of this case isn't just the number of defendants, it's how the trial is being conducted. In the United States, it's extremely rare to see hundreds of defendants tried together in a single criminal proceeding. Large federal gang investigations are often divided into multiple trials, with separate juries, individual evidence, and different court schedules. El Salvador has chosen a very different approach. Rather than holding 486 separate trials, prosecutors are presenting the case as a single mass proceeding under legal procedures adopted during the country's state of emergency. Government officials argue that this method allows the justice system to process an extraordinary number of organized crime cases more efficiently, especially when prosecutors allege that the defendants were part of the same criminal organization operating under a centralized command structure. According to court records, 413 of the defendants are already in government custody, while 73 others are being tried in absentia, meaning the proceedings are moving forward even though those individuals remain fugitives and have not yet been captured. The sheer size of the courtroom proceedings has drawn worldwide attention. Supporters describe the trial as a historic effort to dismantle one of the most violent gangs in the region. Critics, however, question whether a case involving hundreds of defendants can provide every individual with a full opportunity to challenge the evidence against them. As the trial continued, prosecutors began laying out the evidence, they say, connects the defendants to years of organized criminal activity, and that evidence would become one of the most closely watched aspects of the entire case. As the trial moved forward, prosecutors began presenting what they describe as a substantial body of evidence collected during years of investigations. Because the case is being conducted under legal procedures adopted during El Salvador's state of emergency, the court is operating under special rules that differ from the country's traditional criminal process. Supporters of the government argue that these measures are necessary to handle cases involving large, highly organized criminal networks. Critics, however, believe those same rules raise important questions about fairness and due process. According to Salvadoran prosecutors, their case is built on multiple forms of evidence rather than a single source. They say investigators have gathered witness testimony, ballistic and forensic reports, intercepted communications, and statements from former gang members who decided to cooperate with authorities. Prosecutors argue that when these pieces are viewed together, they establish how the organization allegedly planned crimes, communicated with members, and carried out violent operations over many years. One of the most serious allegations involves the gang's leadership. Prosecutors claim that some senior MS-13 leaders continued directing criminal operations even while incarcerated. According to the government's case, certain leaders allegedly used smuggled cell phones to communicate with gang members outside prison, issuing orders for murders, extortion, and other criminal activities, despite being behind bars. These allegations form an important part of the prosecution's argument that the gang maintained an organized command structure regardless of whether its leaders were in custody. However, it's important to emphasize that these are allegations made by prosecutors during an ongoing legal proceeding, and it is ultimately the court's responsibility to determine whether the evidence proves those claims. Now, for American viewers, this is where the story becomes far more complicated than a simple crime case. While many people support the government's aggressive campaign against gangs, human rights organizations, legal advocacy groups, and the United Nations have expressed serious concerns about the way these mass trials are being conducted. Their criticism is not necessarily about whether gang violence exists. It is about whether the judicial process provides every defendant with an adequate opportunity to receive a fair trial. Critics argue that when hundreds of defendants are prosecuted together, it becomes extremely difficult for each individual to challenge the evidence presented against them or receive the same level of individualized legal representation that would normally be expected in a criminal case. Another concern involves the thousands of arrests made during the nationwide crackdown. Human rights groups have reported cases in which individuals were allegedly detained based on factors such as suspected gang affiliation, tattoos, anonymous tips, or simply living in neighborhoods known for gang activity. Salvadoran authorities have rejected claims of systematic abuse, maintaining that the arrests target criminal organizations. Nevertheless, government officials have acknowledged that some detainees have been released after authorities determined there was insufficient evidence to continue holding them. These developments have fueled an ongoing international debate. Supporters argue that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary action to restore public safety. Critics counter that even during a national security crisis, governments must safeguard due process and protect innocent people from wrongful detention. If you're finding this documentary informative so far, don't forget to hit the like button. It helps this video reach more people who enjoy fact-based true crime documentaries. As the courtroom battle continued, The trial evolved into more than just a prosecution of alleged. It became a global debate over the balance between public safety and individual rights, a question that remains at the center of discussions surrounding El Salvador's anti-gang strategy. While international criticism has received significant attention, there is another side to this story, one that many Salvadorans say cannot be ignored. Supporters of President Nayib Bukele's anti-gang campaign argue that the government's aggressive response fundamentally changed everyday life in El Salvador. Before the nationwide crackdown began in 2022, many communities had spent years living under the constant influence of powerful gangs. According to residents, business owners, and government officials, extortion had become so widespread that many small businesses were forced to pay regular protection money simply to stay open. Refusing those demands could allegedly lead to threats, violence, or even death. For ordinary families, the fear extended beyond businesses. Parents worried that their children could be pressured or forced into joining gangs, while many neighborhoods were effectively controlled by criminal organizations rather than local authorities. In some areas, residents say gangs decided who could enter or leave certain communities, creating an atmosphere where many people felt the government had lost control. Supporters of the crackdown argue that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary action. They believe traditional law enforcement strategies had failed for decades, and that a more aggressive approach was the only realistic way to dismantle organizations that had become deeply embedded in society. President Nayib Bukele has repeatedly defended his government's strategy. At one point, he compared the mass prosecution of alleged MS-13 leaders to the Nuremberg trials held after World War II, describing the proceedings as a historic effort to hold those accused of terrorizing an entire nation accountable. That comparison has drawn both praise and criticism internationally, with supporters viewing it as a symbol of justice, while critics argue that the historical contexts are fundamentally different. As of July 2026, the landmark trial remains ongoing. According to Salvadoran prosecutors, the presentation of evidence has concluded, and the prosecution has delivered its final arguments before the court. Prosecutors are requesting the maximum penalties allowed under Salvadoran law, arguing that the alleged crimes represent one of the largest organized criminal campaigns in the country's history. If convicted on multiple counts, some defendants could face sentences totaling hundreds of years in prison, reflecting the large number of charges prosecutors have filed against them. Whether those sentences will ultimately be imposed remains a decision for the court after it evaluates all of the evidence and legal arguments. At the same time, this isn't the only courtroom battle involving MS-13. Separate criminal cases connected to the broader anti-gang campaign have already resulted in convictions for numerous alleged gang members. In several of those cases, Salvadoran courts have handed down prison terms of 40, 50, and even 60 years, underscoring the government's determination to pursue lengthy sentences against individuals found guilty of serious organized crime offenses. Taken together, these prosecutions demonstrate that El Salvador's campaign against MS-13 extends far beyond mass arrests. The government's objective is not only to detain suspected gang members but also to secure convictions through the judicial system. Whether this strategy will be viewed as a long-term success or continue to generate international legal and human rights concerns is a debate that is still unfolding as the trial moves toward its eventual conclusion. So, what does all of this mean for the United States? Although the massive trial is taking place in El Salvador, its impact reaches far beyond that country's borders. For American law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, and communities that have dealt with MS-13 for decades, This case is being watched very closely. Despite the extensive crackdown in El Salvador, MS-13 continues to operate inside the United States. Federal authorities have investigated the gang in numerous states, where members have been accused in cases involving homicide, drug trafficking, racketeering, extortion, weapons offenses, and other violent crimes. Over the years, agencies such as the FBI, Homeland Security Investigations, and the Department of Justice have pursued large-scale investigations aimed at dismantling MS-13 networks operating within the U.S. The gang's history is also deeply connected to both countries. After MS-13 was formed in Los Angeles during the 1980s, the deportation of convicted gang members back to El Salvador helped spread the organization into a country that was already struggling with the aftermath of civil war. Over time, what had begun as a street gang evolved into a powerful transnational criminal network with influence on both sides of the border. Today, some security analysts believe that as Salvadoran authorities continue targeting the gang's leadership, remaining members could attempt to reorganize or strengthen operations outside El Salvador, including in parts of the United States. Others argue that the sustained pressure from law enforcement in both countries has significantly weakened the organization's ability to coordinate large-scale operations. How MS-13 evolves in the coming years remains a question that investigators on both sides of the border continue to monitor. Ultimately, this case highlights two very different philosophies for combating organized crime. In El Salvador, the government adopted an emergency strategy centered on mass arrests, expanded police powers, and large-scale prosecutions designed to dismantle criminal organizations as quickly as possible. In the United States, authorities generally rely on lengthy investigations, federal conspiracy cases, RICO prosecutions, forensic evidence, confidential informants, and constitutional due process protections. While these investigations often take years to complete, they are designed to ensure that every defendant receives an individualized legal process before conviction. Each approach has supporters and critics. Supporters of El Salvador's strategy point to the dramatic decline in violence and argue that extraordinary action restored safety to communities that had suffered for years under gang control. Critics acknowledge those improvements, but argue that protecting public safety should never come at the expense of fundamental legal rights and due process. That debate is likely to continue long after the verdicts in this case are announced. One thing, however, is beyond dispute. The outcome of this historic trial will become an important chapter in the global fight against organized crime, and legal experts, governments, and law enforcement agencies around the world will be watching closely to see what happens next. Now we'd like to hear from you. Do you believe El Salvador's aggressive anti-gang strategy was necessary to restore public safety? Or do you think the concerns over due process and human rights outweigh the results? Share your perspective in the comments below. We always enjoy reading thoughtful discussions from viewers around the world. And if you enjoy professionally researched true crime documentaries, international gang investigations, cartel cases, and major criminal trials explained in depth, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next documentary. Thank you for